See if this is a yes. Well, thank you for this invitation to speak. I'm very honored to be here. I want to thank TAMEST for the invitation. Before I begin my talk, let me acknowledge my group. This is the Computational Hydraulics group at the University of Texas. We are housed in ISIS, the Institute for Computational Engineering and Sciences. I also want to acknowledge my collaborators, especially Phil Obedient and the Speed Center at Rice University, Casey Dietrich, who's at North Carolina State, Rick Ludick and his group at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Johannes Westerink and his group at Notre Dame, and Gordon Wells and Teresa Howard, who are in the Center for Space Research at UT Austin. And also I want to acknowledge the funding that we've received from various federal and endowments, especially the NSF, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Homeland Security, especially FEMA, SPEED, which is funded by the Houston Endowment, and the oil spill work is funded by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. This is the fund that was established by BP after the oil spill. And also I want to acknowledge ISIS and TAC, the Texas Advanced Computing Center, and XSEED for our computational resources. So an outline of my talk is I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we do with coastal ocean models, and then talk a little bit about the modeling framework that we've developed over the past several years, which is called SWAN+ADCIRC. And then I'll show you a validation study that we did for Hurricane Ike. Hurricane Ike happened in 2008, but it's actually taken us several years to really understand what happened during that storm. And out of that work, we have started to look at some new protection systems for the Houston region, and I'll talk about one idea, which is called the Centennial Gate, which is designed specifically to protect the Houston Ship Channel. And then I'll move in the latter part of the talk to discuss how we have extended that modeling framework to look at the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and some of the ramifications of that. Okay, so the two applications that I'm going to focus on then are hurricane storm surge and coastal inundation. And I want to emphasize here I'm talking about modeling the flooding due to the hurricane, not the actual atmospheric dynamics of the hurricane. And there's two aspects of modeling hurricanes that we focus on. The first is hindcasting, which is where we go back and we look at historical hurricanes and we try to understand what happened during those hurricanes so we can do a better job of predicting what might happen in future hurricanes. And then forecasting, which is where in the actual event of a hurricane, we run our model in real time to try to provide guidance to emergency managers. So, for example, for evacuation. And I'm also going to talk about the ramifications of the oil spill. Now, just at a very high level, what are we modeling in the coastal ocean? Well, we're modeling waves, and we're modeling waves at different scales. So there are what we call the long waves, which are down in this region of the frequency space, and there are short waves or wind-generated waves, which are at this end of the frequency space. So waves actually separate themselves into sort of two distinct scales, what we call long waves and short waves. And for example, in a hurricane, you see both types of waves. So in fact, the waves that you actually see visually when you go out to the ocean are these waves here. Those are the waves that ride on top of the water, that you see white capping and so forth. The waves that you really can't see are the long waves, but they're both important and they interact, and they're actually modeled differently. So there are different mathematical models for the waves here than there are for the waves here. Now, what are some of the challenges that we face? And I got this cartoon from Wikipedia, but it pretty much summarizes the things that we face when we want to model the interaction of these waves with things like the coast. Okay, so first of all, what generates the waves? Well, we have wind, pressure, gravity. So we have various forces that we have to account for. Then we have the waves interacting with the bottom of the ocean. which introduces a bottom friction term. And so if you think about storm surge, you have waves being generated by the wind. They're being pushed onto the shore. Well, what's going to cause resistance to those waves? Well, it's the bottom friction that causes resistance. And so, of course, the more bottom friction you have, the better. And then once the waves come onto the shore, then you have waves interacting with land. And we have to model these very complicated coastlines. We end up with very rough domains and very complicated boundary conditions that we have to deal with. And then as you move further inland, you have the waves interacting with structures, with vegetation, and so forth. Okay, so over a number of years, over really almost 2 decades now, we've been working in this area, and the modeling framework that we have developed consists of 2 codes, one for long-wave physics, one for short-wave physics. The long-wave physics code is called ADCIRC, which stands for Advanced Circulation Model. It solves for the water elevation and velocity of water. It was developed primarily by a team led by Notre Dame, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and my group at UT Austin. And then this model is coupled to a shortwave model called SWAN, Simulating Waves Near Shore, which was actually developed at TU Delft. And we had a project with this group a few years back to actually couple these models tightly together. So the SWAN plus ADCIRC model is a tightly coupled finite element model. And in typical simulations that we do with the model now that it's been highly developed is, a few million degrees of freedom and hundreds of thousands of time steps. Now, I know in many applications that's not very impressive, but in our field, these are some of the largest calculations that are being done. The model executes on large-scale HPC platforms, and it scales beyond 10,000 cores, and this is where our TAC collaborators have been very helpful. So some of the recent applications of the model, it's been used to hindcast or study all of the major Gulf of Mexico storms since 2005. It was used to design the new levee system in southern Louisiana. It's been used now for these mitigation strategies for Houston-Galveston, which I'll show you in just a second. It was used to develop new digital flood insurance rate maps for pretty much all of the states along the Gulf Coast and some along the East Coast. It's used as a hurricane forecasting tool, and we use it in our group to provide guidance to the Texas Division of Emergency Management. It's now going to be adopted by NOAA as one of their forecasting tools in 2015. That work is going on now. Has to go through a fairly extensive validation process. And then, as I mentioned, we adapted the model to the simulation of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Now let me talk about Hurricane Ike. So Hurricane Ike happened in 2008. I think we can all remember that storm pretty well if you lived in Texas during that time. It traversed the Atlantic Ocean. It first made landfall in Cuba as a very strong Category 4 storm. It kind of weakened a little bit, and then it moved out across the Gulf. And once it got in open water, it strengthened again. It was a very big storm. It actually, at landfall in Houston, Galveston actually, was only a Category 2 storm, which doesn't seem like a very strong storm, but it was such a big storm and it had so much momentum behind it that it created a huge storm surge. So when we model the storm, we actually model this entire domain, even though what we're primarily interested in is what happens in this region. And that's why we use finite element models, which can allow us to vary the discretization levels across the scales of the ocean to the continental shelf to the inland region. So what I'm going to show you now is a 10-day simulation, a hindcast. The winds for this simulation were actually developed by a company called Ocean Weather. They're an atmospheric modeling company. The simulation that I'm going to show you is a 9 million node, which means 27 million degrees of freedom plus another, for the short waves, we have another degree of freedom, so that's another 9 million degrees of freedom. And the simulations were performed on the Lone Star computer at TAC. So what I'm showing you here, I'm going to show you a sequence of time snaps here of the water levels, the water levels in meters. This is above a sort of, let's think of mean sea level here. What you're looking at is the coast of Louisiana and the upper coast of Texas, and the vectors here are the wind speed. The solid line represents the track of the hurricane. Now, Ike made landfall on September 13th of 2008, and I'm going to show you going back to September 10th, this was the situation. So the storm is somewhere out in the Gulf here, but we're starting to see a little bit of surge build up along the Louisiana coast here. Now, as we go forward a few hours, we see a little bit more surge building up in Louisiana. And then this is about 2 days before landfall. Again. And now what we see is the start of a very interesting phenomena, which is we would call the Ike forerunner. It turns out that the Texas-Louisiana shelf is a very broad, sloping, slick shelf. And so once waves are formed, say over here off the southeastern coast of Louisiana, those waves can propagate very quickly a very long distance. And so even though the winds are blowing sort of offshore, we see a wave starting to propagate from east to west. Part of that is due to the Coriolis force. So once this wave develops, then we see, and this is about 24 hours before landfall, we're seeing roughly 1 meter to 2 meters of surge already building up all along this region of the continental shelf. And that's caught a lot of people by surprise. In fact, the night before landfall, people were trying to evacuate, and there was already roughly 6 feet of water all along the coastal regions where many of these people were trying to evacuate. So this forerunner event has now been pretty well documented. It doesn't happen in very many places. Texas is one of those places where it does happen. And also this forerunner event, this pre-surge event, happened in the Galveston 1900 hurricane as well. Ike has many similar characteristics to that hurricane. So this is right pre-landfall. You can see that the wind now is pushing water onshore. We're starting to see a massive wave approach land. This is right after landfall. So now we have the significant surge, which was primarily to the east of Houston. And so this is sort of the aftermath of the storm. Now we see the recession of the storm surge. And this takes actually several days for all of the water to drain out of the coast. So this was an event where the surge actually propagated about 10 to 15 miles inland. This region that was primarily affected to the east of Houston is low coastal marshland. There's not a whole lot of frictional resistance there. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of people who live there either. So it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Now, in these validation studies, what we're trying to do is, in these hindcast studies, what we're trying to do primarily is validate our model. Now, there are lots of measurements. So after the fact, people go in and they measure what are called high water marks. So if you look, you can see kind of where the maximum water levels occurred in any given region. And we compare the output of our model to what was measured. And so what I'm showing here, these little green dots or yellow dots, are the differences between what the model produced and what was actually measured. And green and light green mean that we are within 0.5 meter of what was measured. So most of the domain, we are within 0.5 meter of what was actually measured. There's a few places where you see blue or orange, which means we're outside of the 0.5 meter range, but that's probably areas where either we didn't capture the physics completely correctly, or we didn't have enough resolution, or there may be even problems with how the measurements were done. So this is pretty good. If we do a scatter plot of all of the different measurements, and you can see we're going from surges down around 0.5 meter all the way up to 5 meters. Then we see a nice tight fit here, and we see an R squared of, what is that, 0.9, which is pretty good. Okay, so now that we have confidence that we really do understand this system and that we can pretty well predict storm surge in this region. So what we can do with this now is use this to look at scenarios of a possible future. So what are possible things that could happen in the future? Or even going back to Ike, what could have happened with Ike? Suppose Ike had made landfall 10 miles or 20 miles down the coast. So this is some work that we're doing with the Speed Center, and the first thing that we did here was we tried to envision some worst-case scenarios based on Ike and some similar storms. We're also doing some work in generating ensemble storms based on future climate. I won't get to talk about that today, but this is a big area of research is, what will be the hurricane climates of the future. We developed then some possible mitigation strategies. We've tested and refined some of these strategies. And I'm going to focus on this one idea, which is the Centennial Gate, which is, again, primarily designed to protect the industry along the Houston Ship Channel. So these sort of Ike-like scenarios, we varied the landfall of Ike up and down the coast, and we finally settled on one point, which we call point 7. There were a number of other scenarios, so we called this point 7, which had landfall near the western end of Galveston Island. And the reason that we chose that point is we wanted to see what landfall location would have the most impact on Houston in particular. Then we varied the intensity of the storm by increasing the wind speed by various percentages. And this basically, we first increased by 15%. We call that storm Mighty Ike. That goes from, say, a Category 2 to a Category 3 storm. And then we increased it by 30%. We call that storm Super Ike, which is roughly a Category 4 hurricane. So what I want to show you, so those are the tracks now. This is Ike moved down the coast. So if Ike had made landfall more towards the western end of Galveston. These are the maximum water levels during Ike. So I'm focusing now specifically on Houston, Galveston Bay. And the colors here go from 0 to 8 meters. So this is what actually happened during Ike. And if we moved Ike down to point 7, you can see that we would see a significant increase in the storm surge, especially in the Clear Lake area and going up the Houston Ship Channel. Now, if we increase the wind speed, this is Ike versus Mighty Ike, you can see that that would have been much more devastating in the impact region. But if we now move that storm down to point 7, you can see that that would have been really catastrophic for Houston. Now we're seeing storm surge up in the 6 to 7 meter range. And if we now increase by 30%, that should scare you, okay? So that is 8 meters of water here. Pretty much all throughout Clear Lake, League City, Texas, all of this region that's on the western half of Galveston Bay, up through the Ship Channel. Now, the Centennial Gate is designed on the gate in Rotterdam. It's a gate, of course, which would be open to allow for navigation, and it would only be closed during a significant storm event. So the gate is about 25 feet high, and there's a couple of scenarios. One is gate option A, which is a little bit further up the Ship Channel. Gate option B, which is further down the Ship Channel, and would also perhaps protect more of the population that are behind it. So what I'm going to show you then is some simulations that we did with and without these gate options. So this is Hurricane Ike without the gate, and I'm focusing really just on the western half of Galveston Bay here. And I've changed my color scale, so now I'm only going up to 6 meters. So if the gate was in place, you could see that it would, in fact, have protected this entire region from surge. With Mighty Ike, Again, the gate manages to hold back the surge. And of course, what we have to be concerned about is what would be the collateral damage. I mean, you're holding back that much water, it has to go someplace, right? And of course, this is a big concern. So of course, this gate is probably not the entire solution. It's going to have to be built in concert with some other mitigation factors or mitigation strategies. And this is with gate option B. Gate option B is just a little bit further back towards the bay. It also works in terms of holding back the surge, both with Ike and with Mighty Ike. And if we compare the gate if we compare the surge with and without the gate, this is a difference of the two simulations with option A and with option B for Ike. And basically, it causes an increase of the water levels in the bay by only about 1/4 of a foot. And there is a little bit of collateral damage in the sense that there's some flooding in this region, which wasn't there before. If we go to the stronger storm, there's a little bit more collateral damage with option B down in this region, so we would have to think about how could we create breakwaters or something which would decrease that additional flooding. But I want to show this simulation just to kind of point out the problem, the political problem that you have here. So this is that Mighty Ike storm moved down to 0.7. The gate is again holding, it's doing its job, but there's quite a bit of, the region which is not protected. And of course that's a big concern. What about the people who live down here? What about the people who live over here? So of course there's another option being floated out there called the Ike dike, which is essentially a seawall which would go all the way up the coast, and there would have to be a gate option here. And in theory, that would protect this entire region. The question is, what would be the environmental impact of building such a structure? Is it feasible? What would be the cost of building such a structure? So these are some of the debates that are going to happen over the next few years. Now, in the final few minutes, let me talk about how we extended the model to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So the spill happened in 2010, and it really caught everybody by surprise. The scientific community, certainly the federal government, certainly BP, and immediately many groups across the country jumped into action, and they tried to model what was happening. We were one of those groups. One of the problems that we had was we didn't have any data to go with. Pretty much the only data that we had were satellite images that we were getting through the Center for Space Research, which were being fed to NOAA. And those satellite images could sort of delineate the oil when the weather conditions permitted. And we were using that then as sort of initial conditions for a model of the surface oil. So we only had access to what was happening on the surface. Nobody knew what was happening beneath the surface. So I'm going to show you some work that we did and a simulation that we did of a period during the spill event. It was June 13th through 23rd of 2010, where there actually was fairly good satellite coverage. So we added an oil spill tracking algorithm to our model. So we have the winds, the currents, and then those move the oil around. And starting on June 13th, this was the satellite image for that day. So we initialized our model with that satellite image, with digitized satellite image of the surface oil. And then we did a 10-day simulation using the winds that were actually provided by the Weather Service. And what we're going to try to do is see how well our model could predict 10 days out where the oil would move versus what actually happened or what was seen on the satellite. So going forward a couple of days or a day or so, this was the satellite image. The red hatches is the model output. So if we overlay those two, you can see that the black is the satellite image, the red is the model. So there's pretty good overlap here. As we go a little bit further, though, you see that oil is starting to move towards the Florida coast. And the model is also predicting that, but oil, in the satellite image, oil sort of appears and disappears. Of course, oil that just suddenly appears, we can't account for that in the model. So there is going to be some discrepancy here. Then the spill sort of started to break up, at least in the satellite image. And then it started to move back towards the Louisiana coast. But still, overall, even 10 days out, the model is pretty well tracking the general movement of the oil spill. And so what we measured here was the overlap between the model and the satellite image over the 10-day event, and we sort of calculated the percentage of overlap. And even after 10 days, we're still getting about 60% overlap between the model and what was observed in the satellite image. So just to summarize here, the code that we've developed is a validated model for storm surges, which is now widely used as a hindcasting and forecasting tool. It allows us to study the impacts of various hurricane protection systems. The same basic modeling framework is applicable to a number of other problems. Oil spills is just one application, but there's a number of other coastal applications for which the model can be used and is being used. Some of the things that we want to do in the future is to capture some of the other important effects. For example, sediment scour. How does the coast change during a catastrophic event such as a hurricane? We need to do a better job of modeling fluid structure interaction, the impacts on things like wetlands. We need to do ensemble analysis to better quantify the uncertainty in our models and how storms of different tracks and sizes and strengths can affect the results. Of course, there's a lot of questions about future climate, future sea level rise. How's that going to impact future hurricanes? The oil spill modeling research is ongoing. I'll say that BP, the funding that BP has provided has funded a number of consortia who are looking at various aspects of the oil spill. And I've learned a lot from working with one of these consortia, and we still don't know a lot. We don't know how oil moves in 3D, for example. How does subsurface oil move to the surface, and how do they interact with each other? How does it move from the Deepwater to the coastal shelf and into the bays? There is actually no numerical model right now that can handle all those different scales, and so that's going to be a challenge for the future. So thank you for your attention.
One of the issues after Hurricane Ike was a dispute for homeowners whose homes were damaged about whether it was the water, the storm surge, or the wind.
Right.
To what extent can your models and the wind models give the temporal answer about which came first and destroyed a house?
Well, so our model does capture both effects, and in some regions, it would do it down to the level of detail that you would need to sort of understand what happened in a specific neighborhood. Our model goes down to about the 50-meter level of resolution. So you could, in fact, I was actually approached by the windstorm insurance group about doing some modeling after the event, and they ended up doing their own work, but our model could be used for that, and in fact is being used in that context by some consulting companies.
I was very interested in the description you had of the Centennial Gate and the simulations that you performed. I was curious whether you or any other groups have looked at a similar proposal in southeast Louisiana. Whether such a gate system is even feasible given the various inlets where storm surge can come in and affect inland coastal areas.
Well, our model is being used to design the levee system in southern Louisiana, which includes some of these gate options. there are a number of proposals out there right now. Gates are just one option. There's ideas for building up barrier islands using oyster reefs and so forth. I think what I hope to see over the next, say, decade is a systematic study of, the effectiveness, both from, their ability to mitigate storm surge, but also just cost effective for all of these various options that are being considered. And we can, with this model, we can actually look at a lot of those different scenarios, and we can place gates in different places. But you're right, the collateral damages could be, have to be considered when you have all of these complicated features, these small channels, and we have to get down to the level of detail where we can actually model those accurately.
Thank you.
Okay. I think you did a very good job in showing the storm surge with the mighty Ike and the super Ike. But you did that by increasing the wind speed. Mm-hmm. What happens if you slow down the forward advance of the storm?
Right.
How sensitive is the flooding to that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I didn't show any simulations of that, and that's something that we've done not necessarily with Ike, but with other scenarios. The forward speed is very important, and so
that's what happened at Sandy. Is the slow forward speed was what killed them.
You're absolutely correct, and that's another sort of unknown that you need to include in one of these ensemble analysis situations, which is something that we're going to be doing.
Okay.